Welcome back. Hello friend, about 90% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you also don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comment. I had been hiking deep in the woods all morning when I found an old farm cabin. It was hidden away, half covered by thick trees and tall grass. The place looked like nobody had been there for years. The wood was worn out, and one side of the roof had caved in. I'd never seen this cabin on any map, even though I had spent a lot of time planning this trip. But I was curious, so I decided to get closer. As I got nearer, I saw just how old it really was. Rusted tools were scattered around the yard, and the windows were boarded up. Some of the boards had fallen off. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. Dust hung in the air, and the place smelled like wet wood and rot. The cabin wasn't big. It had just one room. There was a broken table leaning against the wall, and shelves full of old jars. I didn't even want to think about what might be inside them. I walked around carefully, not touching anything. The floor creaked with every step, and I noticed that some of the wood had holes in it. As I explored the back of the cabin, I saw a door that looked like it led to a cellar. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I should open it. Something about going down into that dark cellar made me uneasy, but I couldn't stop myself. The door groaned as I pulled it open, and I saw steep wooden stairs going down. They looked like they could fall apart any second. The space below was pitch black. I took out my flashlight and pointed it down. The light cut through the darkness, showing a dirt floor at the bottom. It looked like nobody had been down there in a long time. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I started going down. The air got colder with every step. When I reached the bottom, I saw that the walls were lined with more shelves, just like the ones upstairs. But these shelves were also filled with jars, and I could see strange things inside them. I didn't want to get closer to find out what they were. There was also an old, rusty furnace against the wall, and the smell down here was even worse. It made my stomach turn. I was ready to leave, but then I noticed something strange. There was a patch of dirt in the corner that looked different from the rest of the floor. The ground had been messed with recently, like someone had dug there. I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't seen anyone for miles. Who would have been out here? Just then, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint, like something scraping against the floor above. My heart started pounding. I quickly turned off my flashlight and stood still, listening. The scraping stopped. The cabin was silent, but I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone. Trying to stay calm, I backed away from the strange patch of dirt and moved toward the stairs. I heard the sound again, closer this time, like something was moving slowly upstairs. I took each step as quietly as I could, trying not to make a sound. My flashlight stayed off. I didn't want to let whoever or whatever was up there know I was coming. When I reached the top, I slowly closed the cellar door behind me and paused to listen. The noise had stopped. All I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like forever. Then, I heard a rustle outside the cabin. I stepped out, my hands shaking, and closed the door behind me. It creaked loudly in the quiet forest. I didn't move for a moment, waiting to see if I heard anything else. But the woods were silent. I started walking quickly, not bothering to look back. Something inside me told me to leave and not question what I had just experienced. I hurried through the trees, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that nobody had been there. But deep down, I knew something was off. That patch of dirt in the cellar kept popping into my mind. Someone had been there recently, and whatever they did, they didn't want anyone to find out. As I reached my camp, the sun was already going down. I packed my stuff in a rush, desperate to get out of the forest before it got dark. I started hiking back toward the trailhead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. The shadows in the trees seemed darker, and I felt like something was following me, staying just out of sight. I never told anyone about the cabin. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. That patch of dirt in the cellar wasn't just disturbed. It was hiding something, and whoever had been there wasn't finished with it. I had been working as a forest ranger in the US for more than 10 years, and most of the time, the days blended into each other. Long hours alone watching over the forest. I was assigned to a small, old cabin deep in a part of the forest where not many people go. The cabin was basic, no electricity, just a wood stove for heat, a bed, and a few things to get by. It had been built years ago by rangers before me. I liked being out there, away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees for miles. One evening, after finishing my rounds, I settled into the cabin, ready to call it a night. The sun had just gone down, and the sky was turning dark. I lit an old lantern and sat down at the small wooden table to jot down some notes about the day. The forest was quieter than usual. Normally, you'd hear crickets, the wind moving through the trees, maybe an owl in the distance. But that night, there was nothing, just complete silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some nights were like that, where the animals seemed to disappear. I went back to writing, trying to ignore the strange stillness. After a little while, I heard a sound outside. It was faint, like something moving through the leaves. I stood up and looked out the small window, but there was nothing there. It could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, or maybe just the wind. But then the sound got closer. It wasn't a soft rustling anymore. It was a slow, steady crunch of leaves and branches, like something or someone was walking toward the cabin. I reached for my flashlight on the table, clicked it on, and pointed it out the window. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were the trees and shadows. No movement, no animals, just the same eerie silence. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was small, and I'd always felt safe there, even in worse conditions out in the wild. But that night, I couldn't relax. The uneasy feeling stuck with me, and I found myself glancing out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see something watching me. Then, just when I thought I might be overthinking it, I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin. It was sharp and sudden, like something heavy had hit the wooden wall. I jumped up, my heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight again. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out onto the small porch. The night was pitch black, except for where my flashlight shone. The trees stood tall and still, their branches barely moving in the slight breeze. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of an animal, no fallen branches. The ground looked untouched. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The silence was back, heavier than before. Even the breeze had stopped. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I scanned the trees one last time before heading back inside and locking the door. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just being out here too long. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I had spent too many nights alone in the woods. I went to bed, but sleep was hard to come by. I stayed alert, listening for any sound, waiting for that noise to come back. Hours passed, and at some point, I must have drifted off. But when I woke up, it was still dark, and something was wrong. I sat up and realized the cabin door was open. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew for sure I had locked it. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight from the table. I clicked it on and aimed it at the door. It was wide open, slowly creaking on its hinges. My mind raced, trying to figure out what had happened. Was it the wind? But there hadn't been any wind strong enough to do that. Was it an animal? But animals don't open doors. I froze, standing there in the middle of the cabin, unsure of what to do next. That's when I saw it. Footprints in the dirt just outside the door. They were human. The tracks led away from the cabin, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. Someone had been out there. They had been close enough to open the door without me hearing them. I hadn't heard a thing. I stood there, flashlight in hand, paralyzed by the thought of what had happened. Whoever it was, they were still out there. Maybe they were watching me right now from the woods, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to step outside. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat at the table, flashlight ready, listening to every creak and crack. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my things and left the cabin. I didn't stop walking until I made it to the ranger station, miles away. I filed a report, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't find anything. The forest was too big, too isolated. Whoever it was, they knew the area better than I did. They knew how to move quietly, how to stay hidden. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, I still wonder who or what was out there that night. I wonder if they're still in those woods, watching, waiting for the next ranger to come by. Whoever they were, they weren't looking for a conversation. They were waiting for something, and whatever it was, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I'd never been part of anything like this before. The air around the cabin was cold and still, making everything feel tense. I was only here to clear out an old family cabin deep in the woods, a job I got stuck with after my uncle passed away. But when I arrived, something didn't feel right. The cabin hadn't been touched in years, but there were fresh footprints leading up to the front door. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe some hunters or hikers had wandered by. The cabin was in a remote spot, but it wasn't impossible for someone to come across if they were deep in the woods. As I opened the door and stepped inside, a musty smell hit me right away. Stale air mixed with the smell of old wood and dust. But there was something else too, something metallic in the air that I couldn't quite figure out. The cabin had one big room with a fireplace and a couple of small bedrooms on the side. The floor creaked loudly under my boots as I walked through. I was just trying to make a mental list of what needed to be done when I noticed the basement door. It was slightly open, which was odd because I remembered that door always being shut when I visited as a kid. I stood there for a bit, staring at the door, wondering if I should even bother going down. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door wider, and a strong, awful smell rushed out. It was overwhelming, something foul, like something had been rotting for a long time. I almost turned around right then, but something inside me pushed me to keep going. I had to see what was down there. The wooden steps creaked with each step as I made my way down, the air getting colder as I went. There wasn't much light, just enough to see that the basement had been disturbed. The old beams on the ceiling were the same, but the floor wasn't. The dirt had been moved around, uneven, like someone had been digging. My heart pounded as I spotted something sticking out of the dirt. It was a torn piece of fabric, part of a jacket, and it looked too new to have been there for long. That's when the panic hit. I backed up quickly, nearly tripping over the steps as I rushed out of the basement. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I saw. It didn't take long for it to sink in. There were bodies buried down there, and not just one. Someone had been using the cabin for something much worse than I ever imagined. I bolted out of the cabin and called the police right away. The wait felt like forever, even though it was only about 40 minutes. By the time they got there, I had already gone over everything in my head 100 times, trying to make sense of it all. The police were quiet and careful as they started searching the area. They asked me a few questions but treated me like a witness. Still, I could feel their eyes on me, like they were wondering if I knew more than I was letting on. When they went down into the basement, I didn't follow. I stayed outside, staring into the trees, listening to the sound of the police moving through the woods, searching for more signs of what had happened here. Time seemed to drag on, and before I knew it, the sun was starting to set. I felt trapped in this nightmare that I couldn't escape. After what felt like hours, one of the officers came back up and gave a nod to the others. From the look on their faces, I knew they'd found more than I had. They didn't tell me much, but I overheard bits and pieces. There were multiple bodies, some that had been there for years and others more recent. Whoever had been using the cabin as their dumping ground had been doing it for a long time, quietly, and without anyone noticing. I don't know if they'll ever catch the person responsible. They asked me if I had seen anyone or if there were any signs of people nearby, but I hadn't. It's like whoever did this had been careful, sneaking in and out of the woods without leaving a trace, except for what was buried beneath the cabin. I haven't gone back to the cabin since that day, and I don't plan to. Every time I think about it, I can still smell that awful scent from the basement, the smell that hit me as soon as I opened that door. The police closed off the cabin, but I know it's still there, filled with its dark secrets. I was just unlucky enough to find them. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I wonder if the person who buried those bodies is still out there, walking through the woods, hiding in the shadows. I wonder if they know I found their hiding spot, and if they're waiting for the right moment to come back. The cabin might be locked up, but that doesn't stop the memories from creeping in, reminding me of what I found and what might still be out there. One day, I'm afraid they'll come looking for me. I went to visit my grandparents at their cabin, way out in the woods. It had always been a peaceful place to me, where everything felt quiet and calm. They'd lived there for years since they stopped working, and I'd spent many summers there when I was a kid. But this time, something was off. The cabin looked the same as always, simple, made of wood, surrounded by tall trees. It was as quiet as I remembered. My grandparents were still the same too, kind and welcoming. But there was something strange in the air, something that made me feel uneasy. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining it, that maybe the silence was just messing with my head. The days moved slow out there. The silence wasn't like what you get in the city. This kind of quiet felt heavy, and at night, it was full of weird sounds. Branches cracking, animals rustling around, and the wind blowing through the trees like a low whistle. My grandparents didn't seem to mind at all. They acted like it was normal, just the way it was living in the woods. But for some reason, I couldn't sleep. Every night, I'd lie awake, feeling restless. One evening, I took a walk around the cabin, hoping it would help me relax. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The ground near the edge of the woods looked like it had been dug up. There were patches of dirt that didn't look natural. I stood there for a while, staring at them, trying to figure out what might have caused it. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just animals digging around. That night, I couldn't sleep again. The sounds outside seemed louder than before, almost like footsteps crunching through the leaves. But every time I looked out the window, there was nothing. I felt on edge, like something was wrong, but I didn't want to worry my grandparents. They seemed perfectly fine, as if nothing unusual was happening. The next morning, I decided to go for another walk. I needed to clear my head. When I walked past that same spot by the trees, I stopped. The patches of dirt had been disturbed again, but this time something caught my eye. I crouched down to get a better look and saw something sticking out of the ground, just barely visible. My stomach dropped as I realized it was the top of a shoe. I froze, my heart pounding. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there was no denying it. Something was buried there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I stood up quickly, backing away from the spot, my thoughts all over the place. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew this wasn't right. The rest of the day, I watched my grandparents more closely. They went about their day like everything was normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew exactly what was buried out there, just a few feet away from the cabin. They never mentioned it, never acted like anything was strange. They kept smiling, talking, doing what they always did. I didn't stay another night. The next morning, I told them I had to leave, making up some excuse about needing to get back home early. I drove away from the cabin, speeding down the dirt road, my mind still spinning. I haven't gone back since. Now I can't stop thinking about it. I wonder how many times they've done this, how many people have ended up buried in those woods. How long have they been getting away with it? And how many others have visited, only to disappear without a trace? Every time I think of how normal they seemed, how they never let on that anything was wrong, it chills me to my core. The scariest part? I'll never know what would have happened if I stayed another night. I had been excited about this trip for a while. A few days in a cabin deep in the woods, far from all the noise, seemed like the perfect break. It was late September, and the leaves were turning red and orange. The cool air felt fresh. The cabin wasn't anything special, just a small wooden place with a bed, a wood stove, and a few chairs. It had no electricity, no running water. That was part of the plan. No phone service, no internet, just me and nature. The first night was peaceful. The fire crackled in the wood stove, keeping me warm, and the quiet of the woods felt calm. I could hear some animals in the distance, but nothing unusual. The next morning, I went for a walk, exploring the trails around the cabin. The deeper I went, the more alone I felt. The trees were thick, and the bushes were dense. After a few hours, I turned back, not wanting to go too far. That evening, something started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire, and it suddenly hit me that the usual sounds of the woods had stopped. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence. It was unsettling. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the animals had just gone quiet for the night. But something didn't sit right with me. I kept looking out the window, staring into the dark woods, expecting to see something, though I didn't know what. The next morning, I found huge footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were fresh. My stomach dropped. They weren't animal tracks, and they were way bigger than mine. The weird part was, I hadn't heard anyone come by during the night. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just a hunter passing through, but I didn't believe it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the day close to the cabin, staying within sight of it, and kept checking over my shoulder. The woods felt different now. It was as if the trees were watching me. By the time the afternoon came, I was back inside, locking the door. I didn't feel safe anymore. The sun went down fast, and the fire kept burning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. They were slow, heavy, moving around the cabin. My heart raced, and I stayed frozen in bed. I didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard a light scraping against the wall, like someone was dragging their hand along the wood. I didn't move. I tried to keep my breathing quiet. Time seemed to stretch on forever before the noises finally stopped. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed my stuff. I wasn't sticking around. When I stepped outside, I froze. The footprints were back, deeper this time, circling the cabin several times. And on the wall, scratched into the wood, was a single line. I couldn't read the whole thing, but I didn't need to. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching me. I hurried to get out of there. The drive back through the forest felt endless, and I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone or something behind me. When I finally got home, I tried to forget about the whole thing. But every now and then, I still feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes, I wake up at night and think I hear footsteps outside my window. I tell myself it's my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know someone found me out there in the woods, and I think they're still watching. The sun dipped low over the French countryside as I settled into my old cabin, a simple place hidden in the thick woods. I had left the army years ago, looking for peace and quiet, far from the chaos of my past. This cabin, with its squeaky floors and rough wooden beams, had become my safe haven. As the day turned to night, I lit a fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth spread slowly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I listened to the crackling wood and breathed in the fresh scent of pine that filled the air. Outside, the forest buzzed with life, crickets chirping and leaves rustling. But there was an uneasy silence creeping in with the night. After finishing my dinner, I decided to take a short walk along the trail behind the cabin. The moonlight shone through the trees, lighting my way. It felt peaceful, but a strange feeling crept over me, like someone was watching. I hadn't felt that way since my time in the service. I shook it off and focused on the familiar sounds of the forest. After a bit, I spotted something odd, a faint light flickering deep in the woods. It was strange. I had walked this trail many times, and I knew there were no houses around. My curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly moved toward the light. As I got closer, I saw it was a small clearing, and in the center stood an old, rusty truck with dim headlights. I could hardly believe my eyes. Who would be out here at this hour in an old truck? Caution took over, reminding me of my army training. I moved slowly, trying to look inside the truck. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the shadows near the truck. My heart raced as I stepped back, realizing I wasn't alone. Something was hiding just beyond the moonlight, lurking in the trees. My instincts kicked in. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, my boots thumping against the ground. Behind me, I heard branches snapping, something heavy following me. I reached the cabin door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the old lock. Once inside, I quickly shoved a heavy table against the door. My breath came in quick gasps as I leaned against the door, straining to listen over the pounding of my heart. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I waited, every nerve in my body on edge. Time dragged on, and each second felt like an hour. Outside, the forest was still, but that feeling of being watched came back, stronger than before. I peered out through the window, expecting to see eyes staring back at me. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting through the trees. It was low to the ground and moved fast. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't human. Whatever had been hunting me was still out there, waiting for its chance. As dawn broke, the light began to brighten the forest. I carefully opened the door, still feeling the weight of the night's terror. The clearing was empty now, but the truck was gone. The only signs of something being there were the broken branches scattered around and a heavy, unsettling quiet that filled the air. I knew then that I would never go back to that clearing. Whatever had been lurking there, whatever had growled in the dark, was still out there, hidden in the trees. A chill ran down my spine as I felt a heavy dread settle over me. I would stay in my cabin but wouldn't step foot into those woods again. This place, which I once thought was a peaceful refuge, reminded me that some battles don't end with a victory. They linger, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As I closed the door behind me, I realized the truth. The woods had eyes, and they were watching me. I could feel their gaze like a weight on my shoulders, knowing that my time in this cabin was only a temporary escape from the danger that waited just outside. The forest was alive and it was hungry. I drove up to the cabin, the tall trees standing dark and foreboding against the setting sun. This place held memories of better times, when we were together, enjoying life's simple pleasures. But after the divorce, I hadn't been back. I thought it might help to spend a weekend alone, to think things over and maybe stir up some old feelings. Inside, the air felt stale, filled with the smell of old firewood and forgotten laughter. I dropped my bags and opened the windows, letting in the cool evening breeze. The sounds of nature began to break the silence. The rustling leaves, the chirping crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was calm, but there was a strange feeling in the air that I couldn't shake off. That night, I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and settled into a chair with a book. As I turned the pages, something flickered in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving just outside the window. I paused, straining to see into the darkness, but nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination playing games. As the fire crackled, my thoughts drifted back to happier times. I remembered our first trip to this cabin, the laughter we shared, the warmth of our hugs under the stars. But those memories felt far away, like a dream that had faded with the morning. I shook off the thoughts and went back to reading, hoping to push away the creepy feeling creeping up my spine. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside, a soft thud, like something heavy dropping to the ground. My heart started racing as I set the book aside and listened. The cabin was dark, lit only by the flickering firelight. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking as I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cold against my skin, and the forest felt alive around me. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, looking for anything strange. Suddenly, I saw a figure just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was a man, tall and broad, standing still as if waiting for me to make a move. A wave of fear hit me, mixed with an odd sense of familiarity. He looked like someone I used to know, a flashback to a summer spent with friends. I wanted to call out, but no words came. The figure took a step closer, and panic surged through me. I turned and ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. Inside, I felt both safe and trapped. My heart pounded as I tried to calm myself. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the crackling fire. Then came a loud knock on the door, shaking the wood frame. My heart raced again, and I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly in my hand. The knock came again, more urgent this time. I couldn't see who it was through the peephole, but I couldn't just stand there. I knew I had to face whatever or whoever was out there. With a deep breath, I opened the door a crack, flashlight aimed at the figure outside. To my shock, it was my ex-wife. She stood there, her eyes wide with fear and regret. Relief washed over me, but confusion quickly followed. She had come looking for me, worried when I didn't reply to her texts. We both felt a rush of emotions, recalling our shared past. She stepped inside, and I closed the door behind her. The warmth of the cabin felt different now, heavy with unspoken tension. As we sat by the fire, sharing bits of our lives since the split, I realized that this weekend was more than just a chance to think. It was an opportunity to reconnect, to see if we could build something new from what we lost. We talked late into the night, laughter and memories filling the space. Outside, the darkness loomed, but inside, an uneasy warmth began to grow. Just then, we heard a noise, a sharp rustle outside, followed by a low, menacing growl. The laughter died on our lips as we exchanged uneasy glances. I grabbed the flashlight again and aimed it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing at first. Then, just at the edge of the trees, I caught sight of something. Two glowing eyes stared back at us, unblinking and hungry. My heart dropped as the reality hit me. This wasn't just a feeling. We were not alone. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing in the quiet night. My ex-wife's face went pale as the shadows shifted outside, revealing the shape of a large creature moving closer, blending in and out of the trees. I gripped the poker tighter, knowing that whatever it wasn't friendly. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The fire dimmed, and we were plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I scrambled to keep calm. The creature was now right outside the cabin, its breathing heavy and labored. We could hear the claws scraping against the wooden walls, searching for a way in. I turned to my ex-wife, but she had gone quiet, fear written all over her face. In that moment, I realized that even in this frightening situation, our shared past felt like a distant memory. The connection we were trying to rebuild felt fragile, like the flickering flame of the fire that could go out at any moment. Just as I felt the weight of despair settle in, the scratching stopped. The cabin was eerily silent, but we knew it wasn't over. The feeling of being hunted hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. Outside, the darkness thickened, and the eyes disappeared, leaving us with only the sound of our racing hearts. I knew then that this cabin would hold more than just our memories. It would become a place of fear and uncertainty. Perhaps we'd come seeking comfort, but we found only dread, a chilling reminder that the past could come back in the most unexpected ways. The weekend wasn't just a second chance. It was a fight for survival, and we both realized the darkness outside was nothing compared to the shadows we carried within.